So today I'm going to be looking at two legal cases for the CYOA assignment. The very first case that I chose was on a girl named Jacqueline Rowett, who was born with Down syndrome in a self-contained class for retarded at J.A. Gibson Public School in the town of Maple. And the case argues that the parents of Jacqueline, Mr. and Mrs. Rowett, want their child to be placed in a regular classroom rather than a self-contained class very separate from her peers. And the second case I chose was a child named Nabaz Ismail, who was identified as an exceptional student and was placed in a special education classroom to which his mother objects. And these two cases are very similar in how it's being dealt with, especially with the school boards of TDSB and York Region. And that's one of the reasons why I chose it, because I have assisted in both TDSB and York Region in both my volunteer times and also in my practicums as well. So I wanted to just, as an Ontario teacher, understand how these case studies are going to be dealt with and what kind of actions are going to be implemented on students who are in this kind of category, and how, as a teacher, are we going to be able to help out with the child, and how is the laws and regulations and things like that going to be sort of implemented to make a child be placed in a separate class from his or her peers. And this is one of the reasons why I chose this case, because it gives me a better understanding of how I, as a teacher, would be able to deal with cases like this when it comes to me. And also, I chose this case study, these two case studies, because one of them was from the 1990s and the other one was from recent times. So just to look at the comparison of how law was sort of implemented in the 1990s in terms of Educational Act and our Charter of Freedom and Rights versus that same act and law in today's century, and how and what kind of difference is it between the 1990s versus today's generation. And as an Ontario teacher, I have assisted with a teacher who dealt with something like this very recently. It was a child who she suggested that he be placed in a special education program, and parents obviously neglected that idea, and so there was ongoing meetings with the principals, with the teachers, with VPs, and with the parents, and it was just ongoing conflict back and forth as to why he should be versus why he shouldn't be. And as a teacher, what kind of things do we have to look at when we are trying to place, a child into a different classroom? What kind of evidence are we supposed to provide? And all of these things are very important for me as a teacher to understand. And that's also one of the reasons why I felt like looking at these case studies gives me a broader understanding of the Education Act and the Charter of Rights and the OCT Act, and how all of this sort of plays into a role as how, as individuals, we have to play a role in deciding the future for a child. And just looking at this case study, it relates to a lot that we discussed in the course, one of which that I just talked about was the Education Act, and the other one that we also talked about in this course was the Charter of Rights and Freedom. And from looking at these laws, the decision that was made in the case of Jacqueline was that she was going to be placed in a self-contained class, while in the case of Nafaz, he was going to be placed in a special education class for the subjects of math and language, and 50% of the time in his class he was going to be assisted by a teacher. So just looking at the decisions that were sort of made, you can kind of have an understanding that parents do actually have the right to come in and say, I don't accept the fact that my child is being placed in this program. And according to sections 36, 4, and 6 of the Charter of the Education Act, the parent has a right to appeal, and by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, section 15, the plaintiffs have right to appeal for any decisions that was made by the board, they have the right to come in and say, I object to this and I want my child to be placed in a regular classroom. Of course, not always does it come their way where their child is actually placed in a regular classroom. And looking at the Jacqueline's case study, which was case study number 1 that I looked at, even though the decision was made that she was to be placed in a self-contained class, parents obviously objected to that and they appealed for it, but still that was the final decision that was made, and they still didn't like it, so they ended up taking her out of York Region and placing her into a private school, and that's where she goes now. But in the case of Nafaz, even though parents also objected to it, but they had no choice because parents' income wasn't as great to afford for a private school, so he was instead just placed in the special education class just for those 2 languages and was always assisted by a teacher. So it's not always the case that as parents they get what they want, even though they can make that appeal, and that's just something that I've learned over looking at these case studies. And according to the Education Act, when I looked at what an exceptional pupil is and why these students are to be categorized and what makes them categorized into different classrooms separate from their peers, and looking at the definition, it says that an exception pupil means a pupil whose behavioral, communicational, intellectual, physical, or multiple exceptionalities are such that he or she is considered to need placement in a special education program by a committee of the board. So it's something that's not made just by teachers. It's something that's made as a whole team effort from the board, and not always do parents agree with this, and that's sort of where the conflict of interest occurs. And in my opinion, as a teacher looking at both of these case studies, and just thinking about my last practicum, where I actually had a child who was autistic, who was placed in a regular classroom, and obviously parents wanted that, but obviously it was very hard for the teacher to sort of deal with the autistic child versus every other child in the classroom. And just going into that classroom and looking at that environment, I realized that parents do have to understand that there is a reason why teachers object to the thought of having children be placed in a regular classroom, especially if they do have a disability or if they are categorized as exceptional students. And that's just something that, just looking from that incident, understanding how much trouble this autistic child was going through and how he didn't really have any friends in the classroom, and judging people, and that whole idea of being inclusive is just totally demolished in that case scenario. And that was one thing that I saw, and that's another reason why I wanted to look at these case studies, just to have a better understanding of why parents do what they do, and why teachers and school boards, why they make those decisions, is something that is very important to understand. And just looking back at that practicum that I was, and just seeing what that child was going through, I just wish his parents were a little bit more understanding of why he should be placed in a special education program, and why he needs that constant assistance. And if he was placed in a different classroom, he could probably make friends who probably won't judge him, won't look at him weirdly, he would feel a lot more comfortable. But obviously parents feel that if they are taken away from a regular classroom, that they are not considered a child who is normal. So it's unfortunate, but that child is still in the autistic classroom, in that regular classroom, and I guess there's really not much that teacher can do, and just try her best in sort of implementing lesson plans. But at this point, there was really nothing that we could do. And even me being a TA, I wasn't even able to help him out in any way because I was held responsible for the rest of the students. So I could just imagine what the classroom teacher was actually going through the whole entire year, trying to implement lesson plans for both that student plus the other students as well. And it was hard to sort of balance both. So this is sort of my report on these 2 case studies. And here are my references. And thank you for watching this.